Hi, everyone. My name is Nikita Oberoi, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and to our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations, Pathways to Action. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the National Academy's Washington, D.C. headquarters are physically housed on the traditional land of the Nacotchtank, Orr, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples, past and present. We acknowledge that the expertise held by different Indigenous communities is crucial to the work of understanding and addressing climate change. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to view right here after the event. If you'd like to ask questions, please submit them in the Slido box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them into the Q&A section of the programming. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in the same location and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. On a more personal note, as a former professional tennis player, I'm really excited to introduce today's climate conversation on the impacts of climate change on sports. Throughout my career, I had always been told unbearable conditions were mind over matter. But data and climate trends are showing that perhaps it's not always about athletic will. There are environmental factors that have and will continue to make training and competing more difficult than previous generations. I hope by having this conversation, we can bring to the forefront measures that can be taken to protect athlete health and safety and to ensure opportunity in sports under a changing climate. I look forward to learning with you about how extreme weather events are impacting the health, performance, and equity of athletes at all levels, from youth to adult and recreational to professional. I'm grateful to be joined today by Tina Muir, who'll be moderating our conversation. Tina is a former elite marathoner and founder and CEO of Running for Real, an award-winning podcast. As an ardent environmentalist, she has worked with the United Nations, as well as with many races in the running industry, including New York and Chicago marathons, on their sustainability initiatives. Thanks again for joining us today. Tina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nikita. And I am very excited to be here as well. And I think if not all of us, most of us have been at some sporting event in recent years where you were either participating or spectating, and you felt much too hot, and it made it hard to enjoy, or maybe you couldn't enjoy at all. There's also alternatives where maybe you've been cold, underdressed, and rather than enjoying the moment, you spend the time counting down until you can get inside and get warm. And we all know deep down that there's probably more of those days ahead. We are in a changing world. And today, rather than being stuck in that, we hope that we're going to help you to work through what the future could look like and how we can still feel hopeful. We know that partaking in sports can promote physical and mental well-being. It can foster personal development and help build community. Sports can also serve as entertainment, have cultural impacts, and can boost economies. In a society that values the power of sports, it's also important to consider what the sports sector will look like moving forward. As we face these new climate realities, such as record-breaking temperatures, more frequent wildfires, athletes of all levels, organizations, and communities will have to adapt to these consequences. So in today's conversation, we're going to be joined by two leading sport ecologists to explore how exactly climate change is impacting sports, implications for athlete health, performance, and environmental justice, and measures that can be taken to ensure the safety, integrity, and future of our sports. So I'm very excited to introduce our panelists, Madeleine Orr and Jessica Murfree. Madeleine Orr is the founder and industry lead at the Sport Ecology Group and an assistant professor of the sport ecology at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on the relationship between sport and the natural environment, with special attention to climate change, risk and adaptation, sustainability, and just transitions to a more inclusive and sustainable future. She recently published the book, Warming Up: How Climate Change is Changing Sport. Jessica Murfree is an assistant professor of sport administration and Hyde Family Foundation fellow at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Jessica studies the effects of climate change on sport through societal implications of climate risks and environmental disparities. Her expertise has informed organizations like Climate Week New York City, Climate Central, and Ocean Conservancy. So to begin, let's think about how climate change is impacting sports and why do we need to think about it? So for both of you, Maddie, I would love to start with you. What is sports ecology and how did you get involved in this space?
Yeah, so thanks for having us. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to do this with Jess. We work closely together, so we're excited to get this invitation. So thank you to the National Academies. Thank you, Tina. Um, Sport ecology was not a thing when Jess and I were in grad school. I guess I'll start with that. It has evolved over time. I started my work in international development, actually, and it took a gap year in the French Alps to come to sport ecology. I thought I was going out to the Alps for what would be like a beautiful season. And, naive me 10 years ago thinking, oh, it's going to be snowy and perfect. And that's not what we got. We had one of the worst snow years on record. And that has implications, obviously, from a tourism perspective. Shifts were being cut, people were being let go. From a health perspective, we saw injury rates go up on bad snow. You start to see that. And then when the good snow did come, we tragically lost 5 kids at a nearby mountain in an avalanche alongside their instructor. 2 weeks later, we lost 2 Czech teenagers. And then 3 weeks later, we lost a whole bunch, like 20 British soldiers who were on a ski trip. So that hit me really hard. It hit the whole community hard. When you have losses like that, it's hard to look away. And I couldn't unsee it. And all of a sudden I started piecing together the implications of that beyond skiing. So it was like, okay, well, skiing, obviously a bit of a canary in the coal mine, but summer sports have similar exposure to the elements, especially outdoor sports, but not exclusively outdoor sports. And I started looking around and seeing it in the water, with paddlers who were coming out of the water in algae blooms with rashes. I started seeing it with athletes collapsing on courts and on football fields from heat. And that spurred a whole kind of decade-long project so far that has not ended. I think it's going to end up being my whole entire career looking at this. And over time, what ended up happening is we started, myself and many, many other researchers, there's a group of 40 of us that work on this together, started thinking through, how do we marry all the different pieces of kind of what we would traditionally see in the academy into a unit of observation or a group that can observe this holistically. Because if you look at it just from a physiology standpoint, you're just going to get the impacts on the body. If you look at it just from a climate standpoint, those folks might not necessarily have that sport knowledge. If you look at it just from a policy standpoint, you might miss some of the science. And so we coined the word sport ecology, a group of us several years ago, to capture any research that explores sport, the natural environment, and the relationships between the two. And those relationships are dynamic and they're changing. Obviously, we're seeing that in live time, but that's always been the case. We've always had a connection between sport and natural environment. And our job is to document those changes, help organizations, individual athletes through those changes, and keep sport as safe as possible for as long as possible.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think most people can relate to the piece of going somewhere expecting one thing, it not being that way, and then also the safety risks. I mean, it is to lose that many lives in that short of a time. I can only imagine that's hard hitting.
Mm-hmm.
Jess, to you, if you'd like to share.
Yeah, I think the beauty of sport ecology, from the standpoint that we're studying it is unique in a sense that, yeah, we're all working towards gaining better understandings of how sport and the environment work together, for and against each other. But at the core of it all, everyone has experience with this. To a degree, anyone who has watched, attended, or played a sport has familiarity with sport ecology. And our group together is really fortunate in that we can bring those diverse experiences back to the forefront. For me personally, I was an outdoor athlete who studied environmental and marine science. And so, in pursuing sport ecology as a field of study, it's been an opportunity to bring those personal elements of me from the activities and the sports that I did to the science that I was interested in studying together continuously over time, because the landscape of the environment and the landscape of sport will continue to evolve.
Yeah. Maddie mentioned that, so often things are looked at from individual perspectives or different areas, but not brought together in the way that you do with sport ecology. Jess, can you give an example of something that you've seen with that, of, people just not considering the other variables in the situation?
Yeah. It's really relevant right now with back to school and back to sport coming off of our summer, at least in North America, the summer conditioning and camps and training, and then just general societal changes with going back to school, starting a new grade, maybe moving for school in a new area. All of those things sort of work against the high level expectations for performance that continue to rise in sport. So right now is a really delicate and vulnerable time for people who compete. But at the same time, we're also seeing returns to high numbers of coronavirus infections, as well as other vector-borne diseases like West Nile virus carried through mosquitoes. So the things that come across the news as headlines really all work together. And that's something that I'm definitely paying attention to right now, the prevalence of heat related illness. And that can go as far as heat stroke and things that are really detrimental to other physiological harms like sunburn that might get overlooked. As well as dehydration, especially in athletes who compete in water sports. It's really difficult to tell how hydrated those athletes are when they compete in the water with things like the amount of sun, the amount of precipitation that foster things like mosquitoes and other really harmful things that create implications for public health at a really, really, really large scale beyond whether or not a student makes their school team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we quite often see the message is changing, but there's still a lot of messaging out there, no pain, no gain. You've got to grit your way through these tough things. And kids are often told, as particularly with high school, maybe even middle school sports, of this is the way it's going to be. Like, don't be weak, get out there, keep pushing. But as you both have mentioned, this can come with really serious and dangerous consequences if we continue to just say, who cares if it's 100 degrees outside? You're building mental toughness. There's so much more to that. So with that said, I'd like us to move deeper into this conversation on athlete health, performance, and equity. First, I do want to remind anyone watching this, be sure to ask your questions in Slido. The box is below the video for you to enter your questions that we will be able to ask Maddie and Jessica at the end. So let's dig deeper into health, performance, and safety. Jessica, what are the implications of extreme weather events on youth and high school health and performances, particularly as we were just starting to discuss there?
Yeah, this is the level of competition that's really interesting to me because it's most often they have the least amount of resources and the least amount of attention and coverage, but the highest level of participation. And so what happens that we see, watching sport on television or keeping up with the news, these are the best in the world. They have the most resources. They are afforded opportunities to compete and travel, and then we get to enjoy it. But there are millions, billions of others who are competing at the youth and the high school level that make the issues there extremely concerning, especially if everyone who's competing at that level has the hopes of making it to the elite professional level. And so this is where we have to start in our conversations. Otherwise, we will run out of Olympians and medalists of all sorts. So thinking about the safety from a performance standpoint among kids is really paramount for that reason, but also because they are the most vulnerable on earth and face a lot of challenges, both related to sport performance, but also social and psychological as well. So the Venn diagram of expectations and wants for youth and high school athletes is pretty complicated. Extreme weather then is difficult to bounce back from. Youth and high school sports not as resilient because they're not competing in these state-of-the-art facilities with dedicated 24/7 full-time staff. A lot of the times it's parents, it's volunteers. The different teams are competing for time to practice or to train. So then we end up with teams that might normally compete indoors like basketball, volleyball, wrestling, gymnastics, having to train outdoors. And then those bodies are not accustomed to that sort of performance. And then we end up with a headline on the expectations that were put on these kids, and then it's some sort of detrimental outcome because of the drastic changes. And then a lot of the times, their ability to compete is dictated by the school year or the school day itself, which poses a lot of limitations on when and how young athletes can compete. We do know that at dusk, there are different environmental harms. I mentioned mosquitoes already. And then there are added barriers to that. I know when I was playing high school soccer, the girls' teams games were always before the boys' games. So we competed in hotter temperatures than the boys, and that was just the normal scheduling scheme. The girls very rarely got the prime time slot because of that. So that put our bodies, which are also physiologically different from the boys, into a more vulnerable situation. Outside of that, though, there are so many inconsistencies across the youth and high school sport level that make making policies or making holistic recommendations really challenging. And like you mentioned, Tina, the landscape has changed. The expectations are higher. Kids are fighting for roster spots or to come off of the bench, and they're pushing through, and we're labeling it as grit and perseverance. But their bodies are changing, and they're learning how to advocate for themselves and might not have the language or the tools to really explain what they might be feeling. And they might be afraid to out of fear for not making the team or not making it off of the bench. We also know that younger bodies are closer to heating elements. So there's this huge boom of artificial turf grass, and it can be tens of degrees hotter than natural turf grass or other playing surfaces. And younger bodies, their core elements are closer to the ground. So their internal organs are closer to the heating source. And this is just from a heat standpoint. This has nothing to do with rain or extended lightning delays, just heat alone, which can be really scary. And it extends beyond the team. It will extend to cheerleading, marching band, and families and friends that come to watch them.
For sure. No, I mean, I've been at plenty of events where spectators and families of someone's passed out from just watching, let alone being one of the athletes out there. And it seems, I mean, this is such a good example of, Maddie, what you mentioned of sport ecology. Actually, just yesterday, I spoke to a group of high school girls. There was about 40 girls on the team, and they talked about, in their races when it's hot and really struggling, but not wanting to let the coach down. Or not wanting to let their families down because they put so much into this. And it seems this is coinciding at a time when, youth, high school, there's more practices, more pressure, as you said, Jessica, like not wanting to be kind of have their name, any reason to be taken off the roster. And so they're just pushing through. And so it's lots of variables coming together that are really putting these kids at risk. So thank you for explaining some of that. And Maddie, for you, how does this differ with collegiate and elite athletes?
Yeah, so most of my work is with collegiate and elite athletes in different parts of the world. I've been fortunate to do field work on every continent except Antarctica now, with athletes directly in their field of play. And we're noticing some trends that look a lot like what Jess is talking about, but in slightly different conditions. So at the college level, and this is important, these are students, they're kids. It's an adult, but they're still very much young people. They don't necessarily feel they have the agency to speak up. So all of those elements that Jess was talking about around athletes feeling that they can't vocalize what it is they're experiencing, and or they haven't been taught how to. And this is part of it. We don't have a culture of explaining injury and wellness to athletes. We don't do it. And as a result, by the age of about 15 or 16, sports psychologists have told us athletes have a unique ability to hijack their amygdala and the part of their brain that tells your body, that shuts it down and says, hey, stop because I'm hurt. That stops working how it's supposed to by 15 or 16. So by that kind of 10th, 11th grade point. Fast forward to college, stakes feel higher, pressure is higher. Often there's something on the line, right? If you're a college athlete and it's your roster spot, that might also be your scholarship. That might be your access to school, which, by the way, is probably also your access to food. And other resources. And at the professional level, it's your job. And so there's a piece around coercion here that is really important to keep in mind, where we are coercing athletes into competing in conditions that may not be safe. And that might sound extreme. And I've run up against my fair share of football coaches, especially, who look at me and they're like, well, in my day. And I like to remind people that the heat waves of the 80s and 90s are not the heat waves of today. So actually, the conditions people competed in then are not the same. And I almost think, it shouldn't have happened then. We shouldn't have been pushing through then. That was also bad. But to do it now is even more egregious. The other thing that's changed over time, and this is especially relevant to the higher levels, is equipment has changed. And so in a rush to have better equipment, and I'm thinking of sports like lacrosse, where they've got, better helmets, better caging, better padding, football, sports like cycling, where the kit is just totally different than it was years ago. We have changed the equipment we're using, which changes the way our body's going to process sweat. Now, fundamentally, and Jess alluded to this, there's two sources of heat at play when we're talking about athletes and heat. It's not just the ambient heat. It's also the exertional heat in your body. So as you move your body, 25% of that energy is going to produce movement. About 75% is burned off as a byproduct as heat. And that is important to consider. It's not so the parent who passes out in the stands from the heat, that's bad enough. But the athlete's producing a whole bunch extra heat just in their body that we have to think about as well. And with pro and elite athletes, what we tend to forget is that the way a body processes and experiences heat is going to be different from person to person. And it's not necessarily, although it can be, but it's not necessarily linked to fitness. So it's not a show of weakness or of ill fitness to experience a bad heat event. And this is where it gets really tricky, because athletes struggle to vocalize and all these other issues. So I've worked with athletes in, I'm thinking of like Pakistan, where they were experiencing extreme heat waves and they were trying to figure out how to get their football team back on the field amid, just after a flood recovery. And then they got hit by recurring heat waves. And so now you're looking at surface stability issues matched with social recovery that has produced all sorts of mental health impacts. And Jess alluded to this. If an athlete's not sleeping because it's too hot, or if an athlete's not sleeping because they have insomnia because they experience devastating floods, or if they're not sleeping for whatever reason, they're not performing either. If an athlete is not feeling safe in their community, whether it's for social reasons, there's a big conversation happening around safe sport right now. If for whatever social reason they don't feel safe in that environment, and or for environmental reasons they don't feel safe, they're also not performing. So we were working through those pieces, and I did the same with groups out in the West around wildfire in the US, where I worked with high schools that had their entire football season shut down. What do you do after that? And how do you get 15 and 16-year-old boys to talk about their feelings after a major devastating event? Because it's not just the event, it's all of the aftermath. And that's where kind of Jess and I have been collaborating on, like, what's the big picture here? How do we bring this all together? How do we get the sports psychologists and the coaches and the climate experts and the forecasters and the weather people and the admin talking together? The good news is the elite and pros have come up with some really good solutions, and we can learn something from that. There are new technologies coming out around body temperature monitoring. That's great. During COVID, it became very normal for trainers to have thermometers that were infrared. They could just put it to your forehead. Now, that's not the best way to take a body temp. The physiologists, if there's any in the room, are going to be like, don't do that. But it's better than nothing. It's better than nothing. The best way to take an internal body temp is a rectal thermometer, but try telling that to a 15-year-old boy. So the infrared thermometer is a step in the right direction. We want them to have that on hand. If we are able to get cooling tubs on the side of the field, we want that on hand. And the pros have started to do this. We also have seen the pros really tackle scheduling. And Jess and I have looked into this. It's the last thing the organizers of events want to do is change the schedule, but it can avoid a lot of things. And we've seen, tennis events increase the number of heat breaks. So if you go to the US Open in the next couple of weeks, you might notice if it gets above a certain threshold, there's a break after the second set for the women and the third set for the men that's a little bit longer, where they actually are allowed to leave the court if they need to. That's unique. That's new. Football, soccer has the same policy. They get a heat break where they can actually leave the field. These are important changes. These are scheduling issues that Jess talked about, the constraints of when these things happen in the day. That's one big scheduling piece, but breaks in play is also important. And we're starting to see it at the pro level, and we need to be adopting that all the way down.
Thank you so much for that. And it sounds like this is another good example that we have here of if you look at it as a problem, it seems so overwhelming. It's how can we possibly change these things? There's too many pieces. It's how can I have any impact? But then each of us, or every person who is involved in a local, an elementary school soccer club that a parent is coaching, all the way up to the governments and the leagues and the organizing bodies. Everyone has a role to play here to advocate for these people or these youth who are not able to do it for themselves. As you mentioned, the elite and the pro athletes and the collegiate athletes are maybe starting to get to a point where they can be more comfortable doing so. But we all have a role to play here. And so I encourage everyone listening, think about that for yourself. What is your role to play in this? Now, Jessica, your work focuses on equity and environmental justice in sports. Can you explain where we're seeing inequities and how climate change is exacerbating existing inequalities in sport?
Absolutely. So we already live in a world and in a society where there are fundamental disparities across what I like to call the isms, categories that humans created to separate one another, whether that is age, race, gender, class, level of education, sexual orientation, we can call anything an ism. And in sport, those isms, those differences between groups are very, very, very easy to see, when maybe in a classroom setting, they're not as easy to see because, based on where you live, if you're in a public school setting, then everyone pretty much in your class might be coming from the same neighborhood. You might belong to the same social groups or community groups, churches, different leagues. But in sport, it's really easy to see those differences. And excluding the environment altogether, enjoying and participating in sport has only become more expensive. And then once we throw the environment in, it also becomes more difficult to access, because people will make inherent choices based on the environment. So if the surf break that you're used to visiting or the ski resort that you're used to visiting, they're not ideal conditions. Maybe they're not getting the snowfall. Maybe they're under construction because there was a devastating flood. Now people who have the means can make different choices and access that participation in sport in a different way. But that's not the truth for everyone. And I like to say that, it's very easy to see the difference between the haves and the have-nots in sport. And so things that are on a very basic level unjust in society get amplified and mirrored through sport participation as well. And as a result of that, the climate and environmental harms that more vulnerable populations will face get amplified through sport, which makes it really hard to do things like improve access and opportunity in sports so long as injustices continue. What's been exciting over the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years really, is a greater push for improving access and opportunity in sport, combating a lot of the social injustices that do make the headlines, that are important to teams and notable athletes. They're fighting for things like healthcare and education, which is really exciting that notable athletes or coaches or organizations feel that they can use their platform in that way. But I will say that those elements for social justice are incomplete in the absence of considering the environment in those conversations. For example, in the United States, there's a large racial disparity in accidental drowning fatalities. There's also a large racial disparity in who has access to swimming lessons and water-based sports. That's not coincidence. There's also a large racial disparity in road cycling fatalities, but Black and Brown Americans make up just a single-digit fraction of road cyclists in this country, but are suffering in the sport at an alarming rate compared to their level of participation. So all of these things really reinforce the injustices that have existed over time, but sport gives us a really good microscope through which we can really, really see them. We don't have to make assumptions about them, but it gives us a good launching point on figuring out where we can go in addressing those larger systemic issues through sport and communicating them in a way that people understand, because people understand sports.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for explaining that, Jessica. And I often find with the world that I'm in running, people say it's just get a pair of shoes and go outside. Well, if it's 100 degrees and you have a nice trail that's very shaded, that's a very different experience to if you're going outside and the cement is or the asphalt is radiating that heat back up. So, you know, I think most people watching this can probably think of some example, and you gave some brilliant ones there of that disparity. Okay, so let's turn it now towards where do we go? Let's look to the future. What are the next steps? What climate impacts stood out to you at the Olympics this year and maybe elsewhere? And what solutions are being undertaken? So Maddie, maybe we can have you answer that one.
Yeah. You know, the Olympics this year were a bit of a wild ride. I was in Paris for it. I was working with 4 different national teams on how they were going to respond to heat and water quality issues, supporting athletes on activism issues behind the scenes as well. We expected Paris to break records on heat. We thought it was absolutely a possibility given the most recent year's track record. You know, last year during the Tour de France, it was into the 35 and 40 degrees Celsius range, which is above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and absolutely devastating conditions for athletes. We were expecting the same and we didn't get it, which was a huge win, subtle. And the athletes would probably say they still suffered, and they did. And it was really hot, but it wasn't as bad as we thought it could be. But we started to see, climate impacts pop up in different ways. And I think it's important that we highlight kind of how these things come together. So the heat in Paris created optimal conditions for E. coli and Enterococcus to build in the sun. Both of these are colony forming units. It's largely from waste that they're developed, but heat makes it easier for them to multiply, and that makes it harder for water managers to manage water conditions. And we did see that come into play during triathlon and open water swimming. For reference, in North America and Canada and the US, our standards for what we would allow people to swim in at a public beach is something like 200 to 300 colony forming units per 100 milliliters is considered like high, but like fine, and that's the limit. Like anything more than about 300, we're saying no. They were swimming in 850. That is within the range of what World Triathlon and World Athletics allows, because these athletes are prepared for those conditions. And by prepared, I mean we were handing athletes like prebiotics and prepping their stomachs and their systems to tackle that. We were making sure that every single open wound was closed ahead of them getting into that water. They were training elsewhere. And so there's a certain amount of kind of immersion therapy type thing. It's the easiest way to explain it, that was happening behind the scenes, but that's not something you see on camera. And what I always worry about with something like the Olympics is that someone's going to sit at home and think, oh, that athlete's competing in 40-degree weather, or they swam in that water, or whatever, and think that that's safe and okay, and not see all of the adaptation work that's happening behind the scenes to keep people safe. Because the cooling towels and the air conditioning under the athlete's seat on the side of the tennis court and all these little pieces that I know about because I'm working on adaptation, but the fans don't see and the camera doesn't catch, leads people to believe that something is normal when it's not. That for me was the big risk of Paris. And I think it's going to continue to be the big risk. It's what I see with something like the US Open right now. Elsewhere in the world, one of the pieces that came up for me this summer, and it's currently ongoing, is storms are wreaking havoc. Right now in Asia, we are seeing two simultaneous cyclone events that are completely devastating regions. There's been reports out of India, Bangladesh, and China in the last year that entire sports teams have closed and folded because they can't compete anymore, and also because the athletes, their lifestyles won't permit them to play, because they now have to go and find work elsewhere because the previous work they had is now shut down because of storms. So it's not just the sport itself, it's the whole entire life around it that shifts when these things happen. And in doing research for my book, one of the kind of glaring stats that I came across came from originally UNESCO, working with them on their new Play for Life work, body of work that they're doing. But then later kind of developed through more work with the International Olympic Committee. And what we were starting to look at is how many Olympic nations will not be able to field a national team as early as 2030. And the number was 20%. We could lose 20% of Olympic competing nations as early as 2030. So by the time LA gets the games, that could be the last time we see a full docket of all of our nations competing. And that should tell everybody everything they need to know about how bad this is. It also should be clear. I guess for me, it's obvious, for Jess, it's obvious, but it's not always clear to people who, if they're not kind of thinking about it. Those nations tend to be those who are along the equator, tend to be impoverished, tend to be historically exploited by colonizers, who don't necessarily have the resource, are indebted to the IMF and other funders, and therefore all of their federal funds right now are going to pay debts and survive. And everything extra, including sport, both for children and at the competitive and elite national team level, is getting cut. And I think that should send alarm bells through everybody in the sports world and beyond, that if we want to have competitiveness in sport, if we continue to want to say you're the best in the world, we need the whole world there to say that. And if the whole world's not there, it doesn't count. So let's make sure that we keep our eye on that, take care of other countries and other communities, whether it's at the youth level and the kind of scale of analysis is your school board or your city, or at the higher levels where it's maybe the nation or your state or internationally. If it's impacting one group, one team, one athlete, it's impacting us all, because sport is connected that way.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. You gave some examples to this, but Jessica, can you share some other ways that can alleviate these challenges that exist that Maddie didn't mention there?
Yeah, I think Maddie did a great job at, providing that point of view from that organizational standpoint, which is critical. We need these teams, leagues, federations, organizing committees to make the right decision to protect people for the long haul. I would also just add that as human beings and as adults, we have some agency in figuring out what our capacity is as a person. For example, here in the state of North Carolina, high school football teams are struggling to field teams. The sport industry is very reactive. It's going to take, and it has taken, a lot of hardship in order to see policy-based changes come into effect and be effective. So now, because there have been increasing numbers of high school football player fatalities in extreme heat, because that is hitting the news. And at one point, when those were negligent, sort of tort law, wrongful death claims, they're now becoming criminal. And adults are being held accountable for the mismanagement of these kids in playing their sport. And they're finally being levied criminal charges. Parents and administrators are making decisions in the best interest of their kid because they have that agency and can make that choice. So it's not necessarily alleviating climate change. The climate is going to continue to change, but we're seeing individuals make choices about how and when and what they want to participate in sport. From a justice standpoint, perhaps by pulling kids who would otherwise be interested in playing football, that might put them into something else. That might put a kid who had never touched a pool into swimming and diving, or into tennis, or into volleyball, and could increase and improve the landscape of other sports because people are making those conscious decisions. Outside of that, there's been more attention on the policies that are intended to protect people, which is exciting. I think we've lived in a world so long that put the sport first. And that's true for a lot of the reasons that Maddie said, because we need eyes on these countries. We need eyes on these regions for a lot of political things. And they're selling usually something else other than the talent that's on the field. But at the same time, there's been sort of the rebirth of policies that protect people from the time and water breaks, but also to being able to make decisions that put people first rather than the financial bottom line. In in college sports in the United States, there's a walk away for free clause that are in game contracts that say, you know what, if both teams agree that it's not feasible or it's impossible to play under these certain circumstances listed in the contract, we can walk away. We can make a good faith attempt to reschedule, or we can just say, you know what, we're going to put our people first, and our people surviving, being healthy, happy, and not necessarily evacuating would be in the best interest of our team. And that's gaining a lot of popularity. Revisiting those policies has really jumped in sort of reviewing and establishing COVID-19 policies. So that's been really helpful in that, because we had this new variable affecting sport, that's allowed organizations to go look at their other policies and make better decisions to protect people. But still, to a massive degree, sports very reactive. And I always ask, like, how much suffering will it take for us to start thinking forwardly about the environment? How much research does our group have to do to really convince the organizers and those in charge to make better decisions, because the environment will continue to change? It's not necessarily fair to say, oh, all of these sports are now going to compete inside. There are entire states in the US that can't field physical education because there is no inside. So what does that mean for participating in sport, which in many cases is not a privilege, but just a basic function of education and human well-being to move our bodies? And from a spectator standpoint, moving sport indoors might contribute to a lack of interest in the sport. We hold on to our fond memories of the environment in the past. We hold on to our fond memories of sport in the past. And if the landscape changes, where now the sports where we love to watch the sunset and the post-game fireworks are now being competed indoors, that might change the fan base entirely, which could then change who participates. There are a lot of innovative opportunities that we're seeing gain popularity to sort of inadvertently adapt to climate change. There are so many more indoor sport options than there've ever been, from golf and even hybrid settings like Top Golf that bring an indoor aspect to the outdoor sport, but then fully indoor golf with golf simulators. There are wave parks and surf parks and these pools that bring the outside in and can bring those sports to non-coastal areas and reduce the vulnerability on those sensitive parts of our coastlines. There are just so many ways that we're seeing the landscape of sport change. For the traditionalists, this will look unfamiliar and might be a bit scary, but it is an opportunity moving forward where the environment, sport, technology, and these other advancements are really pushing us maybe in the right direction. When the headlines broke that the Winter Olympics percentage of artificial snow continued to rise, that really ruffled a lot of people. But a lot of people also didn't know that we've been relying on artificial snow for a long time. So these subtle changes, these subtle adaptations to sport, while some of these major changes are happening, from rules changes in shortening the game and quickening the pace of play, to relocating sports indoors or under domed roofs. These are all options. They're expensive, but at the end of the day, what is more expensive in adapting the sport or recovering from loss of life or lack of participation in sport? And we all will have to make those decisions at some point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. And just another good example of preventative rather than reactive afterwards. So I want to shift now to Q&A. And we've been getting a lot of questions that are kind of asking, Jessica, you were answering some of this in your question there, but Maddie, to you, who is in charge of establishing regulations and protections for youth, high school, collegiate, elite athletes? And what can they be doing to protect these athletes?
Okay, I love this question because the answer is it's complicated. Like every
You haven't
like
got a
everything.
one sentence answer for us?
Okay, at the high school level in North America, there's two groups that you're going to be looking at. Your high school, your athletic association for the that your school competes in is one, and the second one would be your state. More than 30 of 50 states now have high school heat policies, largely that were advocated for and advised by the Corey Stringer Institute, University of Connecticut. Doug Casa and his team are really on this. And informed by the database that's actually held at University of North Carolina by Kristen Kucera and her team at the National Center for Catastrophic Injury. So those two groups have been informing and advising states on adopting policies. Now, policies only go so far. A policy to be really effective should have kind of three major elements. It should have a if-when standards. So if temperatures reach X threshold, then these are the actions that get taken, and there should be levels of that, and it should depend on the sport as well, because different sports have different length of exposure, different equipment they're using, different seasons that they're working in, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're at high school or college, you should be looking to state policy. You should be looking to the Athletic Association in college. That would be the NCAA. The NCAA currently has a guideline, but no policy. At the elite and pro levels, we're following the guidance at the International Sport Federation that is set by the International Sport Federation. And then different tournaments like the US Open, for example, can set their own within that, but it has to comply. So the International Fed would set kind of the high level standard. Generally, these are, in my personal opinion, Jess, I know agrees, like these are very poorly standardized. They're very weak at the moment. I know a lot of research is going into improving these. Some sports are ahead of others in where they're at in that process. It's just not quite there. And they tend to be kind of base level. So they're not clear on like whose responsibility it is to call it when it's hot. And they leave things vague to give those tournament organizers and leagues the opportunity to make those decisions for themselves. But then if you've got a league that doesn't want to do that, then that policy is not going to affect much. So it depends on the level, but always look at your state policy, always look at your athletic association, look at what the International Federation is saying. That should be the baseline, like that's the minimum. But again, it's not necessarily everything. The other part of this is policy is only going to work if people know what to do with it. So if you have got a policy and no one knows it exists, you've got nothing. I like to think of this in three buckets. Like there's policy, and that's important. We need to have policy. We should all be advocating for that. OSHA also, I know in the US, has policies that affect workers. Athletes are an exempt group in Section 1904 Part B. They're not included in that, which is kind of shocking. Particularly athletes that are paid and this is their job, that they're excluded is shocking. At the college level, they're not employees, and I know that's a whole legal debacle, and I'm not getting into it, but we should be taking care of athletes as special groups here. And they're not included in OSHA regulation. So I can kind of pin that there. So policy is one bucket. The second bucket is education and awareness, because Jess and I both talked about athletes can't always advocate for themselves. They don't always have options. There's a lot of coercion going on. So people need to know, athletes need to know, especially with heat. And I want to highlight this. Most of the early signs and symptoms of heat stress, you could pass it off as just about anything else, and people do. So nausea, cramping, lightheadedness, feeling a little disoriented, cognitive, like losing just a little cognitive ability. So you're just slightly less able to concentrate. That makes a big difference in a game like baseball, where we're obsessed with stats, right? It makes a big difference as well for the referees and the coaches, who are also on the field and engaging in physical activity at that time. So we know that the most competitive games are not played in those conditions, because not just athletes, but everyone else is impacted. So we need education. And the third big bucket, so policy education, third bucket, tools. And this is where some of those state policies are requiring schools to have these tools on hand, but it's things like your rectal thermometer. Short of that, get an infrared thermometer. I know rectal thermometer is not fun, but it could be life-saving, and isn't that worth it? I don't know. I would say yes. I would say I want my kid to get that rectal thermometer if the coach thinks they need it. But the tools are also often quite simple. Really, it's, cooling towels, and it's having a hat to wear. Like, take your helmet off, but put a hat on, have a shading tent so that when you're off the field, you're actually in the shade. These are not expensive items. We can figure out how to get these into schools, even in schools that are under-resourced, but you need all three. You need the policy, you need the education, and you need the tools.
Thank you so much, Maddie. That was broken down beautifully. Jessica, we have been talking about organized sports with coaches, but what about sports that are individual or recreational?
Yeah, I think I would just add accountability then to that like beautiful trifecta, because it now becomes who is responsible and who is accountable for this. And at the individual, at the recreational or leisure level, that accountability becomes your own, which can be really challenging because people have a desire to compete or they have a desire to engage in a sport, and might forego some of the other benefits of spending time in physical activity, and pushing through a lot of that in order to engage in their pastime or in their hobby. But it's really important to know the effects, know the risks, be responsible when engaging in those things. I mean, a lot of neighborhoods still have bike helmet requirements that, I mean, if I saw so many people riding their bikes today, I didn't see a single helmet. And so it takes a lot of personal responsibility for sport at that level. But then also knowing and having access to those policies and those recommendations and staying up on it. To piggyback a little bit on what Maddie said, there is this sort of ping pong of responsibility at the team sport level. A lot of the state high school federations in their policies, they'll say, you know, we defer to the national federation. The National Federation heat policy is from NATA, the National Athletic Trainers Association. So there's this constant back and forth of where's the information from, who is the source, and what is required, what is effective, and what is a rule versus what is a recommendation. And at the individual and rec levels, that becomes the participant's responsibility. We live in a world now where access to that information is really helpful. So those who are into trail running or bouldering, a lot of the state and national parks, they are required to provide information from NOAA, from NASA, from the National Weather Service. And they're very good about getting that information out, whether it's signs posted at the entrance to the park, on their social media, or through the contact information that they provide to anyone who's buying a park pass. But certainly there are easier ways to miss all of that information as well. And it's just like swimming at your own risk signs. There is an own risk sign that exists for everything. And the inherent risks now extend beyond, oh, you could get hit by a foul ball, to things that are really coming from the environment. Is it a lightning strike? Is it air pollution? There are things that we can see. There are things that we can't really see, but we can feel them. I recommend that everyone at least have a buddy. Turn your GPS on when you're going out and engaging, and let someone know where you are. Let someone else have access to your medical needs. You know, similarly with the rectal thermometers, a lot of recommendations at the youth level is based on your hydration, and hydration is measured by the color of your urine. But that doesn't take into consideration someone who might have type 1 diabetes or a thyroid condition, where their urine could be super dilute. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting enough water. And so knowing your body, letting others help you and at least be in on your participation, having a buddy, staying up to date on the industry trends, all of these things can help save your own life and then put you in a better position to help someone else that you might run into on a trail or at the beach or wherever.
Yeah, thank you so much. Loads of examples there. As an individual sport person myself, I need to do a better job with a few of those. So thank you for that. Now, let's go into a question about emissions. Several NCAA conferences have reconfigured, resulting in more travel for football athletes and other sports. How is this going to impact emissions and climate? So maybe, Maddie, we could start with you.
Further distance traveled, emissions go up. It really is that simple. I wish I had this one. I actually can answer really fast. These reconfigurations will be devastating from an environmental standpoint if we're considering just emissions. It will also, and this is like not as well discussed, but the athletes are worried about it. It's not fun to have to get on a flight, go 5 hours, play your game, and then fly back that same night because, by the way, you're not allowed to miss that much school in the NCAA. They have rules about this. So there are health considerations here. There's social implications. We all heard about how many Stanford athletes across a number of sports basically lived with their team in hotels and on the road during COVID, kind of in a bubble. Like they're effectively recreating that in this lighter way, but with this policy change. So from an enviro standpoint, it gets a thumbs down from me. This is not good from an emissions piece at all. And it's a step in exactly the wrong direction.
Yeah, very, very tough. And Jessica, in your opinion, should we be limiting that both in major sports leagues, in pro and elite level, collegiate, as much as we can? Should we be trying to change schedules, insist on more usage of public transport? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we need to get a grip on what our priorities are. So my institution is a member of the Atlantic Coast Conference, but we are 2.5, 3 hours from the Atlantic Ocean. So it makes a lot of sense. But with the conference realignment now, we've welcomed, university athletic programs in Texas and in California. And teams will do what is necessary to make travel more convenient for them. So if the men's and women's team of the same sport is competing on the Cali teams, a concerted effort was put into place so that those teams can travel together and minimize that the work needed to get those teams over there. But that wasn't from a cost savings choice. That wasn't we're making the best environmental decision here. It just works out better to get both teams to California and back. And that's really challenging. The infrastructure of North America isn't great for public transit when our minds for sport are wrapped around speed and efficiency. We can't keep our normal schedules and expect us to take 3, 4, 5 times longer using public transit. It simply doesn't work. And if we look at the elite sport levels, the disparities between men's and women's pro teams, there's been this debate over private chartered flights versus commercial flights for over a decade. So if we're thinking about at the college level, we can't even have that conversation because the landscape of the league is changing as we speak. These are students who have to sleep, eat, go to class, manage all of these other things, and the resources that they have are tied to their home campus. They're not necessarily tied to their travel. And so that makes things really hard to wrap our minds around. But at the end of the day, it's the priority. Why did these conference realignments happen? Was it for athlete well-being? Absolutely not. Was it for planetary well-being? Absolutely not. Was it for the financial bottom line? Yes. All of the leading choices and decisions that are happening in college and professional athletics are happening for money. And everything else will be a secondary or tertiary to that. And that is a critique on the leagues and what they exist to serve. Originally, college athletics was birthed out of sport participation being part of holistic educational development. Just like physical education class in K-12, PE was part of school. You got a grade for playing a sport during the school day. And that's how the NCAA came to be in the first place. But we have moved so far away from that and lost sight of these total person programs using sport to develop people holistically and as leaders. And we put money first. And so as long as money is first, everything else will have to be second. And that will continue to be a problem. In the elite levels, that's happening with sponsorship. We are looking to sponsors who can fund us, even if those sponsors are environmentally or health related, if they're detrimental to our health or they're detrimental to the environment, but they're cutting our check, that is winning in sport.
Yeah, absolutely. So many examples of that. Maddie, do you have any examples of maybe the other direction of any major sport leagues that are taking into account climate change impacts on their sport as they plan?
Yeah, we from our kind of perch over at the Sport Ecology Group, we get to see behind the scenes on this sometimes when organizations come to us and say, hey, we've been spending a lot of money getting out of big problems because of climate damage. So for example, last year Formula One teams started noticing this because a couple of their races, they had athletes that were collapsing as soon as they were getting out of the cars. They had people in the pits, the garages, having some like severe heat issues. And these are things that don't make headlines because they do a really good job of hiding it. But that was a real business risk. And to Jess's point, like their impetus to act wasn't that people were getting hurt. It was that was costing them money. So that should tell you everything about where their values lie and what their priorities are. But the result of these experiences were that they turned around to us at Sport Ecology Group and said, hey, can you run some risk radars for us of what races are going to be most at risk, what we can expect to see in different places, what we should have as policies within Formula One. We completed that project. Those results came out a few months ago and are being widely circulated this fall at a number of big conferences and meetings. We're doing the same now. We just partnered with the Green Sports Alliance in the US for 7 professional leagues. So by next summer, we'll have a risk radar for all of the pro leagues in North America who have voiced concerns, but again, largely from a cost like avoidance perspective. We don't want to pay more money because we have climate issues cropping up. But in my research, I've also noticed, so without even having to do that research, one of the things I did for my book is I spoke with representatives from all 5 pro leagues in the commissioner's offices. I spoke to owners in all of the leagues. I spoke to players in all the leagues. And you'd be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't have their eyes on this. They just don't want to talk about it. And those are 2 different things, right? So like often the facility managers, you'd be hard pressed to find a facility manager in a sport like baseball or football who isn't worried about flooding if they're in one part of the country, or air quality if they're in another part of the country, or Texas all of a sudden has to be worried about polar vortexes. Like depending on where you are, they're aware of this because they're the ones who are cleaning up the mess and making sure that football goes ahead on Saturday or whatever the case may be. And including indoor sports. We like to forget about indoor sports when we talk about climate change because it doesn't seem like they're impacted. But let me tell you, having visited a few gyms that have seen some flooding and the floors look like this, that's a cost that they want to avoid. They want to know what's coming so they can prepare for that. And that's exactly what they should do. But it's slow moving and it's really hard without quantifying for them. This is what it's going to cost you. That seems to be the only message that gets through at this point, even though our team is able to like really clearly lay out, this is what injuries are going to look like. This is what you might experience from a social standpoint. The mental health of your staff, that's like a huge one that gets overlooked. A lot of people have jobs in sport. This is an industry that supports a lot of jobs in a lot of communities. And when we have entire seasons that are wiped out or just canceled, those people don't have work. Like it's not just the athletes and the performance, it's all these other elements that go with it. And the pro leagues are starting to pay attention, but only because it's costing them money. And unfortunately, we're going to see change by design or disaster. And it seems like it's going to take disaster.
Yeah. That is a tough thing to hear, but so many examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to shift to health here. Jessica, are there set parameters on when outside sporting events are cancelled based on heat forecasts? And what are the specific air quality and extreme heat benchmarks for this?
Yes, so there are set parameters, but there is no standard, which makes making recommendations really challenging. And I'll just talk specifically about the United States. Across the 50 states, there are heat policies at different levels. There's the high school federation heat policy, but different occupational recommendations that, like we talked about with OSHA, that athletes aren't lumped into that. They're not considered as, outdoor work in the same way that agriculture or construction would fall under the occupational policy. And then colleges often can create their own, but still defer to the federation on the requirements. And then at that level, they're paying for revenue. So a decision would have to be made between both programs, usually both head coaches and the athletic director, and potentially general counsel will have to also be in on making that decision in the best interest of both parties. But at the high school level, there are heat policies that all vary. They vary in what the threshold of temperature is to how it's measured, whether we're taking just ambient temp, wet bulb, and considering humidity, other measures that would take shade, direct sunlight, duration into consideration, they all really fluctuate. Some of those policies will have an asterisk next to them and say football only. But what does that mean for soccer? What does that mean for these other sports? And then there are added layers underneath that that dictate what athletes can wear. So maybe this is just a t-shirt and shorts day, t-shirt, shorts, helmet. Is this a full pads, full equipment practice based on the temperature thresholds? A lot of them are the feels like or the heat index temps, but we're seeing this shift more and more into using the wet bulb because that does take humidity into consideration, which is great because as heat around the world goes up, so does precipitation. So we're breathing air that's wetter than usual. We might not remember how humid it was last summer, but every summer it's like, oh man, it's really humid today. And it could just be a fraction more humid than it was last year. And so seeing that trend is positive, but there's no standard for cancellation across the board. Usually it takes some level of responsible adult to make those decisions based on looking at all of the sources of information. Hopefully there are dedicated athletic training staff who can provide that guidance on what it means for the body. So there's standards on how much water someone needs to consume per 15 minutes of physical activity or per 15 minutes of physical exertion. And then take that and then use the science that we know about the climate that's changing and add that in and consider what the playing surface is and other factors that would alter the reality of what it feels like to actually be doing sport in that location. This can be really challenging though for parts of the country where those state lines get blurred a little bit. There are a lot of school districts that cross state line. And so your heat policy that maybe your club team that's closer to your home follows and you go to school across the state line might look totally different and your expectations might be different. And one of the big problems in those policies is the clause or the standard of when parents are notified. Sometimes that's not provided. Sometimes parents can only be notified if there's a hospital visit, which would be just alarming to me if I were a parent of a kid playing sport that I cannot be called until there's a hospital visit. There are policies on where the ambulance can be located, who can provide first response. There are all of these different layers that make governing this really challenging. But the fact that there are policies and they are being changed is hopeful. I think there are steps in the right direction, that they're really messy right now, which tells me that people are thinking about this. They're at least getting their hands in it so that hopefully we can make progress moving forward.
Thank you, Jess. Maddie, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in. We talked a lot about and Jess had a great answer earlier that I wanted to piggyback on here around when it's just you doing your own exercise. There's some easy rules of thumb here. If anyone's an athlete themselves that you can just follow, this is what I would follow. It's what the National Trainer Association would advocate as well. On heat, regardless of what sport you're playing, start paying attention as soon as it's 85 degrees. That's like your kind of start paying attention now level. And that's where you want to start making sure the easiest thing you can do is make sure you're hydrated, not just during the practice, but pre-hydrated. So you're not coming in dehydrated and then trying to catch up. And the other piece there would just be like, shed extra layers if you can. Once you get into that, anything close to core body temperature, which is like 97, 98 degrees, the average person's core body temperature, that's when we really have to start changing the way we play. And you can make a decision for yourself, whether that's, you move inside, you don't play, you reduce your exposure time, but that's where we start to see a real increase in the risk of really devastating heat illness. So those would be the two numbers I would hold in my mind, 85 and about 95. As soon as you get into that range, pay attention, start making those small edits. That'll make a big difference. And then like Jess said, it's going to depend sport to sport, but like those are just easy rules of thumb. If you're a parent, pay attention to those numbers. On air quality, it's about 100. 150 is when we start to see that it's unsafe, and that's what the AQI would say is unsafe. At 100, it's unsafe for sensitive groups, but you have to consider that if you're exercising outside, you're breathing through your mouth, so you're bypassing your nose's natural filtration system, you're taking in more pollutant content directly into your lungs, which means it goes more directly to your bloodstream. You can, if you're in medium to bad air quality, so anything in like the 150 range and up, you can get about as much pollutant content in about an hour of running outside as you would smoking a whole pack of cigarettes. So just to give you numbers to keep in mind, as soon as it gets into that unhealthy for sensitive groups, consider sport a sensitive group and start reducing exposure time. It doesn't mean we cancel everything. It just means we start to pay attention once we hit those thresholds.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those. Now we've got 1 minute left. I would love for you both to just share one thing you would like our audience to take away from today's conversation. So Maddie, continuing with you.
Talk about this in sport. I mean, most people in North America don't have kind of close connections to nature the way we would have in previous generations. Most people are not working in agriculture or forestry. Sport and recreation is what takes us outside. It's our invitation into the outdoors. So it makes sense to have conversations about climate in that space. Might feel a little unusual at first, but talk about how the heat makes you feel today, what the weather is. These are like, I'm literally saying talk about the weather, but do talk about the weather because we can connect the fun thing to the hard thing. We can use the emotional drive of sport and the connectivity and the social good that we learn in sport to drive change on climate. It's totally possible. We just have to have this conversation more and not think about it as like a separate issue that's over there. So that would be my one big thing, is have the conversation.
And Jessica, to wrap us up.
Yeah, I would just build on that a little bit and think that everyone has something to contribute to these conversations. You don't have to be a climate scientist or a meteorologist to be effective at this, but your observations and your feelings, if you're doing a fantasy draft and you're considering the stats on your players for that week, the environment is a really good thing to talk about and to include. And then pay attention to other people as you engage in sport, being observant and saying something when you see something, being a good team player at the tailgates or at the games. These can really help people who might not have been sitting in on this conversation when all of those factors that lead into just wanting to enjoy a Saturday game or a Friday night game come into play. Know what those risks look like in other people and be observant so that you can help someone, and especially helping those who might not be able to help themselves, like kids, or those who might have different or special needs.
Thank you so much, Jess. Nikita, back to you. Thank you much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina, for moderating that fantastic, informative conversation. And a huge thanks to Jessica and Maddie for bringing this important topic to light. To our audience, thank you for your interest and excellent questions. The conversation was recorded and will be available to view and share on the same webpage immediately after we end. And a huge thank you to all the National Academy staff who supported today's event behind the scenes and for making today's conversation possible. Before we leave you today, just a quick note on upcoming events. Our next climate conversation will be on September 24th, where we'll be exploring water resilience from a global perspective. The conversation will be hosted at Columbia University as a part of their Rethinking Water Conference during Climate Week, New York City. Registration is now available on our webpage to join us virtually. If you'd like to share feedback on today's event or have ideas for future events, please take our survey. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you here again in September.